Do you remember? It wasn't actually, you don't really meet Elvis, you actually just...
Whitney Houston was 6 years old the first time she saw Elvis, standing backstage in Las Vegas, watching a man walk into a room, wearing a mink coat and sunglasses, surrounded by people who all seemed to stop breathing at once. Whitney never forgot that moment. Neither did her mother, who had spent years singing beside him. Tonight we go through what Whitney actually said about Elvis Presley, what their families shared, and how one song connected two of the greatest voices in American music history in ways nobody fully planned. The night in Las Vegas, August of 1969. The International Hotel in Las Vegas had just opened its doors, and Elvis Presley was about to make history inside them. His return to live performance after nearly a decade away from the concert stage had already generated the kind of anticipation that felt less like ordinary excitement and more like a collective holding of breath across the entire entertainment industry. The opening run of shows that month would eventually confirm what the anticipation promised. Presley performing live, after years of formulaic film work that had frustrated both critics and fans, was a revelation. Night after night, sold-out crowds at the International packed a showroom specifically designed and built to accommodate his return, watching a performer rediscover exactly what he was capable of when given a live audience instead of a movie soundstage. Backstage during this historic run, among the people gathered in the specifically charged atmosphere that surrounds a performer of this magnitude during a genuinely significant moment in their career, was a group of backup singers called the Sweet Inspirations. They were one of the most respected gospel and soul vocal groups of the era, having recorded extensively on their own and provided backing vocals for some of the most significant artists of the 1960s, most notably Aretha Franklin, whose use of the group had helped define the sound of several of her most celebrated recordings. Whitney Houston was one of those Sweet Inspirations. She had been part of the group since the mid-1960s, bringing a gospel-rooted vocal authority to the ensemble that reflected her own deep formation in church music, stretching back to her childhood in Newark, New Jersey. She was, by any measure, a genuinely serious professional musician whose presence alongside Presley during this Las Vegas opening run reflected her established standing within the world of American gospel and soul music. She was also the mother of a 6-year-old girl named Whitney Elizabeth Houston. Whitney had come along during at least one backstage visit connected to her mother's work with Presley during this period. The specific circumstances of exactly how the child found herself backstage at the International Hotel in August of 1969 have been described across various interviews Whitney gave over the following decades, always with the same quality of vivid, specific memory that genuinely significant childhood experiences tend to produce. She described, consistently across these interviews, the specific moment Elvis Presley walked into the backstage room. He was wearing a mink coat. He had his sunglasses on. He moved through the space with the particular quality of presence that only a small number of people in any era possess, the kind that changes the atmosphere of a room simply by entering it, that makes people who are themselves accomplished professionals suddenly feel the specific involuntary response of being in the proximity of someone operating at a genuinely different level. Whitney's own description of this moment, given years later to Access Hollywood correspondent Sean Robinson, captured its specific quality with characteristic directness. "You do not actually meet Elvis," she said. "You just have to look at Elvis." This framing, the distinction between meeting someone and simply being compelled to look at them, captured something genuine about the specific quality of Presley's physical and personal presence that countless other witnesses across his career had also tried to articulate, usually less precisely. She described the specific texture of that backstage moment for a 6-year-old encountering it. "It was not like an ordinary introduction," she told Robinson. "There was no conventional exchange of pleasantries, no handshake and hello. The child simply found herself in the same space as the most famous entertainer alive, and that fact alone was sufficient to constitute an experience worth carrying for the rest of her life. It was one of those moments that I won't forget as a kid," she said. "Just to be in his presence was awesome," she added, a word that she appeared to use in its original, literal sense rather than as a casual contemporary hypermole. Something that produced genuine awe, something that exceeded ordinary experience in a way that left a specific lasting impression on a child who would herself, within 2 decades, possess a similar quality of presence that would produce a similar reaction in the people who found themselves in the same room as her. This detail, a future legend encountering a current legend as a child and carrying the specific memory of that encounter with unusual clarity across the following decades, has a particular resonance specifically because of how precisely Whitney's own eventual career and public presence would come to echo the qualities she was describing in that 1969 Backstage memory. The mink coat, the sunglasses, the room-changing quality of entry. These were not simply the accessories of celebrity. They were the outward markers of a specific kind of transformative presence that, within 2 decades, would become equally associated with Whitney Houston herself. Cissy Houston's own recollections of working alongside Presley during this Las Vegas period, shared across subsequent interviews over the following years, added a different, more professional dimension to the family's collective memory of this moment. She was not a starstruck child watching a legend walk into a room. She was a working musician, observing a colleague, and what she specifically observed during their shared time in Las Vegas revealed something about Presley's genuine relationship to the musical tradition both of them had grown up within. That observation, grounded in Cissy's own considerable expertise and professional experience, would shape how both she and eventually Whitney understood and discussed Presley's significance across the following decades. It was an understanding rooted not in celebrity fascination, but in genuine musical knowledge, the specific recognition of one gospel-rooted performer, observing another gospel-rooted performer, each of them shaped by the same foundational tradition in ways that transcended whatever differences of background, race, or commercial trajectory might otherwise have separated them. What Cissy heard that nobody else was saying. Cissy Houston brought something to her observation of Elvis Presley that most people commenting on his relationship to gospel music did not possess. She was not a fan analyzing from the outside, or a journalist drawing connections between different musical traditions for the benefit of readers unfamiliar with either. She was a working gospel musician of genuine stature, who had spent her entire professional life inside the specific musical tradition that had shaped Presley's deepest instincts, and who now found herself standing beside him on a Las Vegas stage night after night, close enough to hear exactly what he was doing with that tradition in real time. The Sweet Inspirations' involvement with Presley's 1969 Las Vegas opening run was not simply a backup singer arrangement in the conventional sense. Presley had specifically sought out gospel-rooted vocal support for this return to live performance, a choice that reflected exactly the musical priorities Cissy would later describe, observing in him directly. He wanted the specific quality that genuine gospel singing brings to a live performance: the emotional directness, the vocal authority rooted in something deeper than technical training, the particular quality that comes from music, learned first as an expression of genuine faith rather than as a commercial skill. Cissy's later recollections of working alongside Presley during this period describe someone whose relationship to gospel music she recognized as fundamentally authentic rather than performative. Elvis loved gospel music, she said in a later interview. He was raised on it, and he really did know what he was talking about. This last phrase, "he really did know what he was talking about," carries specific weight coming from someone with Cissy's background and expertise. She was not offering a general compliment about Presley's musical taste or his ability to perform gospel-influenced material convincingly for a mainstream audience. She was offering a professional musician's assessment of genuine knowledge, the kind of observation that requires direct, sustained interaction to make accurately, and that means something considerably more specific than simple admiration. She continued this observation with a statement that connected Presley's gospel formation directly to everything else about his musical identity. He was singing gospel all the time, she said. Almost anything he did had that flavor. You cannot get away from what your roots are. This framing, the idea that Presley could not escape his gospel roots even when performing material far removed from the church music of his Tupelo childhood, represents Cissy Houston's most precise and most significant observation about what made Presley's voice and performance style specifically distinctive. She was describing not a calculated stylistic choice, but something deeper and less controllable. A musician whose earliest, most foundational formation had so thoroughly shaped his instincts that its influence surfaced regardless of context, in rock and roll, in ballads, in the elaborate Las Vegas productions that surrounded his 1977 residencies, as much as in the simple church music where that formation had originally occurred. Cissy understood this dynamic with particular intimacy because her own musical identity had been shaped by exactly the same process. She had grown up singing gospel in Newark's church communities before her professional career took her into soul, rhythm, and blues, and eventually into the backup singing work that brought her alongside figures like Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley. Her own voice, and eventually her daughter Whitney's voice, carried the same quality of gospel rootedness that she was identifying in Presley. The specific recognizable texture of music learned first in a church by someone for whom that music carried genuine personal and spiritual weight never fully disappears from a singer's voice regardless of what commercial genre they subsequently work within. This was the specific quality Cissy was identifying when she said Presley really did know what he was talking about regarding gospel music. She was recognizing a fellow traveler, someone whose relationship to the same tradition she carried was grounded in the same kind of genuine early formation, rather than the kind of calculated, surface-level borrowing that produces technically accomplished but ultimately hollow imitation. Presley's own behavior during the Las Vegas rehearsals and performances confirmed this assessment in ways that went beyond what his recordings alone might have communicated. Cissy and the other Sweet Inspirations reportedly observed him returning to gospel material constantly during the informal, unrehearsed moments of the Las Vegas engagement, the spaces between formal rehearsal and performance where musicians revert most naturally to the music that matters most personally to them. This pattern, consistent with accounts from many other people who worked closely with Presley across his career, including Larry Geller and others who described his private late-night musical sessions at Graceland, revealed someone for whom gospel music was not a stylistic element to be deployed strategically, but a genuine, ongoing personal connection maintained regardless of the commercial context surrounding it. The Sweet Inspirations continued working with Presley through subsequent Las Vegas engagements, establishing a professional relationship that allowed Cissy's observations about his musical character to accumulate across multiple sustained periods of direct interaction, rather than a single, brief encounter. This extended professional proximity gave her assessment a foundation that most outside commentary on Presley's relationship to gospel music simply could not match. What Cissy eventually communicated to Whitney about Presley, drawing on this accumulated, professional, first-hand observation, shaped how the younger Houston would think about and discuss Presley across her own subsequent career. Not as a distant legend to be admired from the comfortable remove of historical mythology, but as a specific musician whose relationship to a shared musical tradition both Houston women understood from the inside, whose gospel roots they recognized and respected, in specifically professional terms, rather than simply as fans acknowledging a cultural icon's general historical significance. This specifically informed understanding, grounded in Cissy's direct professional experience and transmitted to Whitney through years of the kind of musical conversation that happens naturally within families where music is a professional vocation rather than simply a personal passion, gave Whitney's own later comments about Presley a depth and specificity that distinguished them from the more generic celebrity tributes that typically circulate around figures of Presley's historical magnitude. The song that almost belonged to Elvis. In 1974, a young country songwriter named Dolly Parton topped the Billboard country chart with a song she had written about leaving her professional partnership with Porter Wagoner. The song was called I Will Always Love You, and almost immediately after its release, one of the most significant figures in American music history came calling to record his own version. Elvis Presley wanted to record the song, not as a casual interest or a passing consideration, but with genuine, sustained enthusiasm. By Parton's own account, confirmed across multiple interviews given over several decades, Presley had already gone as far as recording a version before the deal fell through, an indication of how seriously he had taken the possibility of making the song his own. The reason the deal fell through has become one of the more consequential stories in the history of American popular music, specifically because of what eventually happened to the song 2 decades later. Colonel Tom Parker, Presley's manager, contacted Parton with a standard condition he apparently attached to every song Presley recorded by an outside writer. In order for Elvis to release a version of I Will Always Love You, Parton would need to sign over 50% of the song's publishing rights to Presley. Parton's response, delivered after what she described as an agonizing, tearful night of consideration, was no. "This is the most important copyright in my whole publishing company," she told Parker directly. "I cannot do that." The decision cost her something she genuinely wanted. She has said repeatedly across subsequent years that she would have loved to hear Presley sing that song, that she believed his voice and his emotional connection to the material would have produced something extraordinary. The heartbreak of declining was real. She cried all night, she has said. She would have killed to hear him sing it. What made the decision possible, despite that genuine heartbreak, was the specific, principled conviction Parton held about her own songwriting. Her songs were what she was leaving for her family. They were her most important creative legacy, more significant to her than any single commercial arrangement, however personally exciting. Signing away half the publishing rights to her most significant song, even to Elvis Presley, crossed a line she was not willing to cross, regardless of the emotional cost of declining. Parker's demand reflected a standard practice he apparently enforced consistently across Presley's career, ensuring that any outside song Presley recorded generated publishing revenue for the Presley organization, in addition to the performance royalties his recordings naturally produced. This approach had generated considerable income across Presley's career, while also, in at least this specific case, producing an outcome that shaped the history of American popular music in ways nobody involved in that 1974 negotiation could have fully anticipated. Priscilla Presley later told Parton a detail about Presley's connection to the song that revealed just how personally it had mattered to him. According to Parton's own telling of this conversation, Priscilla said that Elvis had sung the song to her as they walked down the courthouse steps on the day their divorce was finalized. He was singing to her, in that specific devastating moment, the words of a song about loving someone enough to let them go. This detail, confirmed by Parton in multiple interviews, transforms the song's failed recording negotiation from a simple business dispute into something considerably more personal and considerably more poignant about Presley's own relationship to its emotional content. Nearly 2 decades passed. The song continued to be performed and recorded by various artists without ever achieving the kind of mainstream global recognition that a Presley recording might have generated in 1974. Then, in 1992, a film called The Bodyguard was preparing its soundtrack, and the question of what song would serve as its emotional centerpiece required an answer. Kevin Costner, Whitney Houston's co-star in the film, suggested I Will Always Love You to her. The suggestion was not immediately obvious. The song was known primarily as a country standard, associated most strongly with Parton's own celebrated versions, rather than as an obvious candidate for transformation into a mainstream pop and rhythm and blues production. But something in the song's emotional directness and the specific quality of its lyrical simplicity connected with what Whitney Houston was capable of doing, with material that suited her voice's particular strengths. What followed has become one of the most documented and most analyzed recording achievements in the history of American popular music. Whitney Houston's version of I Will Always Love You spent 14 consecutive weeks at the top of the Billboard Hot 100 chart, a record at the time for any single. It became the best-selling single ever released by a female artist, and remains one of the best-selling singles in the entire history of recorded music, regardless of gender. Dolly Parton's response to hearing Whitney's version for the first time has itself become a frequently told story. She was driving when it came on the radio, and described being so overwhelmed by what she was hearing that she had to pull over immediately, afraid she would cause an accident if she continued driving, while absorbing what Whitney had done with her song. She said she was shot so full of adrenaline and energy that she needed to stop the car and simply listen to the whole performance without distraction. She later joked that Whitney's recording made her enough money to buy Graceland. The specific geographic and symbolic connection between Whitney's achievement with the song and Elvis's failed attempt to record it 2 decades earlier, encapsulated in a single line that managed to be simultaneously funny, accurate, and genuinely poignant. The song Elvis wanted to sing, that Parton had cried all night over refusing him, had found its definitive version in the voice of the 6-year-old girl who had stood backstage in Las Vegas in 1969, watching him walk into a room in a mink coat, unable to say a word. 2 lives, running, on the same track, The connection between Elvis Presley and Whitney Houston extends considerably beyond a single Backstage childhood memory, and a song that passed from one to the other across 2 decades. Placed alongside each other, their 2 lives reveal a pattern of parallel experience so specific and so consistent that it demands more careful attention than the simple observation that both were enormously talented performers who died too young. Both came from the same foundational musical world. Presley grew up attending the First Assembly of God Church in East Tupelo, Mississippi, absorbing Pentecostal gospel music as a fundamental part of his earliest formation, before he had any conscious intention of pursuing a musical career. Houston grew up singing in the choir at the New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, under the direct musical influence of her mother, Sissy, whose own professional gospel career had given Whitney a more formally sophisticated early musical education than Presley had received, but rooted in exactly the same essential tradition of Black American church music that had shaped the gospel Presley absorbed in rural Mississippi. This shared gospel formation produced in each case a voice with a specific recognizable quality that professional musicians consistently identified as coming from something deeper than technical training. Sissy Houston had identified exactly this quality in Presley when she observed that he really did know what he was talking about regarding gospel music, that almost anything he did had that flavor, that you could not get away from what your roots were. Every serious observer of Whitney Houston's voice identified the same quality in her, the specific directness and emotional authority of someone whose earliest musical formation had occurred in a context where music served genuine spiritual purpose rather than commercial ambition. Both were discovered and developed by figures who understood how to transform extraordinary raw talent into commercial success on an unprecedented scale. Colonel Tom Parker shaped every dimension of Presley's commercial career across 2 decades, controlling access, managing image, and making decisions whose consequences, both positive and damaging, define the entire trajectory of Presley's professional life. Clive Davis, the legendary record executive who signed Whitney to Arista Records in 1983, played a comparable role in her career, identifying her talent before almost anyone else in the industry fully grasped its scale, then shepherding its development with the kind of sustained, expert commercial attention that transformed an extraordinary voice into a global commercial phenomenon. Both achieved commercial success so rapid and so enormous that the music industry had essentially no existing framework adequate to describe or manage it. Presley's rise between 1954 and 1956 had been so sudden and so complete that the industry was still adjusting to its implications years after it had already occurred. Whitney's commercial ascent between 1985 and 1992 followed a similar trajectory, each album and single performance exceeding whatever expectations the previous one had established, accumulating records at a pace that left music industry observers struggling to find adequate historical comparisons. Both found, as the commercial success accumulated, that the specific qualities that had made them extraordinary in the first place, the raw, gospel-rooted, emotional directness of their earliest work, became increasingly complicated to maintain within the elaborate commercial and production structures that extraordinary fame inevitably creates around a performer. Presley's trajectory toward overproduction, which Johnny Cash had identified specifically in his autobiography, reflected the same essential pressure that eventually shaped Whitney's later work as well, the pull of commercial sophistication, gradually covering the raw, specific quality that had originally made each of them so arresting. Both experienced very public, very painful personal struggles during the later portions of their careers, struggles that became the subject of enormous public scrutiny and discussion, while simultaneously remaining, in their most essential dimensions, private battles that fame's visibility made considerably more difficult to address effectively. Presley's decade of prescription medication dependency had unfolded under the specific pressure of a Las Vegas performance schedule that demanded continued productivity regardless of his declining health. Whitney's well-documented struggles with substance use unfolded under the comparable pressure of maintaining a commercial career at the highest possible level, while simultaneously navigating the personal complications that level of sustained public attention inevitably produces. Both died younger than anyone who loved them could accept, in circumstances that shared specific, uncomfortable similarities. Presley at 42, in a bathroom at Graceland, the accumulated toll of years of prescription medication finally exceeding his body's capacity to absorb it. Whitney at 48, in a hotel room bathtub in Beverly Hills, the circumstances of her death involving a combination of factors that, like Presley's, connected prescription medication to a physical decline that had been building for years before the specific moment of its final expression. The parallel between these two deaths was not lost on the people who had known and loved both of them. Whitney Houston, who had stood beside Presley in Las Vegas in 1969 and watched her 6-year-old daughter witness something she would carry for the rest of her life, now found herself outliving both of them, the gospel tradition she had passed to her daughter, and recognized in the man from Tupelo, ultimately unable to protect either of them from the specific consuming pressures that their particular kinds of extraordinary talent had attracted into their lives. This parallel does not diminish either life or reduce either person to a simple cautionary narrative about fame's dangers. Both Presley and Whitney Houston produced work of genuine, lasting significance that continues to matter to people across generations and across the geographic and cultural boundaries that might otherwise separate their respective audiences. What the parallel does suggest, placed carefully alongside the specific gospel connection that linked their earliest formations, is something about the particular price that certain kinds of extraordinary, rootedness-derived talent sometimes appears to exact, from the people who carry it into the specific consuming pressures of extraordinary fame. What Whitney actually said. Across her career, Whitney Houston spoke about Elvis Presley in ways that revealed considerably more than simple celebrity admiration for a historical figure she had encountered briefly as a child. Her comments, scattered across various interviews given between the 1980s and her final years, carry the specific texture of someone speaking from genuine personal connection, rather than performing the expected reverence that famous people sometimes offer about other famous people when the question arises in a public setting. The Backstage Las Vegas memory remained the most frequently cited reference point across these various comments, and the consistency with which she returned to it across decades of interviews suggests it occupied a specific, lasting place in her understanding of her own relationship to the kind of extraordinary presence that she herself would eventually come to embody for other people. She had experienced, as a 6-year-old child, what it felt like to be in the proximity of someone who changed the atmosphere of a room simply by entering it. That experience gave her a specific personal framework for understanding something about her own eventual career that most performers never have the opportunity to witness from the outside before they begin experiencing it from the inside. Her description of the moment across multiple retellings maintained the same essential quality she had captured in her Access Hollywood interview. "You do not actually meet Elvis," she said. "You just have to look at Elvis." This framing, which she appeared to arrive at independently each time, rather than simply reciting a rehearsed formulation, revealed someone who had genuinely processed what she had witnessed as a child into a specific, considered understanding of what set Presley's presence apart from ordinary celebrity. The distinction she was drawing between meeting someone and simply being compelled to look at them addressed something real about the specific quality of Presley's physical and personal presence that photographs and recordings could document but never fully convey. Whitney understood this distinction with particular intimacy because she had experienced the same quality of attention directed at herself across decades of her own career. The specific involuntary response that certain performers produce in people who find themselves in the same space. The kind that operates below the level of conscious decision or deliberate response. Just to be in his presence was awesome, she told Access Hollywood, returning to the same essential observation she had made across various interviews from different periods of her career. This consistency, maintained across years of changing personal circumstances and evolving public narrative, suggests genuine feeling rather than calculated tribute. She was not describing what she thought she should feel about Elvis Presley given his historical significance and her own connection to his world through her mother's work. She was describing what she had actually experienced as a child, standing in that backstage room in Las Vegas in 1969. Her comments about Presley also reflected the deeper, more musically grounded understanding that her mother's direct professional experience alongside him had provided. When Whitney discussed Presley's relationship to gospel music in various interviews, she spoke with the specific authority of someone whose own gospel formation had given her an informed framework for evaluating authenticity in that tradition. She was not simply repeating what historians or music journalists had written about Presley's gospel influences. She was assessing him, at least partially, through the lens of what Sissy had observed directly and communicated to her daughter, and across years of family conversation about the musicians Sissy had worked alongside. This informed musical perspective gave Whitney's comments about Presley a quality of genuine professional respect that complemented her personal, childhood-rooted admiration for his presence. She understood, from her own formation in the same gospel tradition, exactly what Sissy had meant when she said Presley really did know what he was talking about regarding gospel music. Whitney knew what genuine gospel knowledge looked and sounded like from the inside, and her mother's first-hand assessment of Presley's possession of that knowledge carried specific weight within the specifically gospel-rooted musical household Whitney had grown up in. The "I will always love you" connection added another dimension to Whitney's relationship to Presley's legacy, one that she addressed in various interviews after the song's extraordinary commercial success in 1992 and 93. She was aware of the song's history, aware that Elvis had wanted to record it and had been prevented from doing so by Colonel Parker's publishing demand. The knowledge that she had achieved what Presley had been prevented from achieving, that the song, which might have become definitively associated with his voice, had instead become definitively associated with hers, gave her own version a layer of historical resonance that she appeared to carry with appropriate awareness rather than either dismissing or over-dramatizing it. The gospel connection ran through this awareness as well. "I Will Always Love You," while written by Dolly Parton as a country song addressing professional separation rather than romantic loss, had been transformed by Whitney into something that drew heavily on the gospel tradition both she and Presley had absorbed from childhood. The famous extended opening note that has become the most recognizable single moment in the song's recorded history. The pure, unaccompanied vocal phrase that precedes the full arrangement's arrival carries the specific quality of someone trained from earliest childhood in a tradition where a voice alone, without instrumental support, is sufficient to fill and transform a space. It is, in its most essential musical character, a gospel moment placed at the beginning of a pop song, reflecting exactly the rootedness that Sissy had identified in Presley's relationship to the same tradition. Whitney never gave an extended formal statement, specifically addressing the full scope of her connection to Presley's legacy, the gospel roots they shared, the song that had moved from his unfulfilled desire to her definitive achievement, the childhood memory of a room-changing presence that had somehow anticipated what her own life would eventually require her to become. But across the scattered specific comments she offered across her career, a picture assembled itself that was considerably more substantial and considerably more personal than simple celebrity admiration for a historical figure could account for. Two voices, the same roots, the same song, finally finding the version it had been waiting for. What their connection still tells us. Whitney Houston and Elvis Presley never shared a stage. They never recorded together. Their actual documented personal connection consisted of a single backstage childhood encounter in Las Vegas in 1969, mediated through Sissy Houston's professional relationship with Presley, rather than any direct personal friendship between the two performers themselves. By any conventional measure of what constitutes a meaningful connection between two public figures, what existed between them was relatively thin. And yet, the picture that emerges from placing their two lives carefully alongside each other, from the shared gospel roots through the parallel commercial trajectories to the eerily similar circumstances of their eventual deaths, suggests something considerably more substantial than coincidence. Two people formed by the same foundational musical tradition, shaped by it in ways that neither could fully escape regardless of the commercial contexts their careers subsequently placed them in, who produced work of genuine and lasting significance while simultaneously being consumed in different ways and at different speeds by the specific pressures that their particular kinds of extraordinary talent attracted into their lives. The gospel connection between them matters specifically because it offers the most honest available explanation for what made each of them extraordinary in the same essential way. despite the enormous differences in their backgrounds, their eras, and the specific commercial genres their careers operated within. Whitney Houston identified it clearly from the inside when she said Presley really did know what he was talking about regarding gospel music, that you cannot get away from what your roots are. Whitney demonstrated it every time she opened her mouth to sing, the specific directness and emotional authority of someone whose earliest musical formation had occurred in a context where music served genuine spiritual purpose rather than commercial ambition. This shared quality, gospel rootedness expressed through voices of extraordinary natural power, was also, in some meaningful sense, what made each of them so difficult to protect from the specific pressures their careers eventually generated. The same emotional directness that made their performances so genuinely moving, so capable of reaching audiences at a level below conscious decision or deliberate response, also made each of them specifically vulnerable to the emotional demands that extraordinary fame placed on them continuously and without respite. There was no protective distance between their most essential selves and what their audiences were responding to. What audiences heard and felt was genuinely them, and sustaining that level of genuine exposure across decades of unrelenting public attention extracted a cost that the particular nature of their talent made impossible to fully avoid. This is not a comfortable conclusion, and it is not meant as a simple cautionary narrative about the dangers of fame. Both Presley and Whitney Houston lived full, complex lives that contained far more than the circumstances of their eventual deaths. Both produced work that will outlast the circumstances that produced it, that continues to matter to people who were not yet born when either of them was alive. The parallel between their lives is not offered as explanation or excuse for how those lives ended. It is offered as a way of understanding something more complete and more honest about who each of them was, and why their connection, however thin by conventional measures, resonates as something real and something worth examining carefully. Whitney's comments about Presley, scattered across various interviews throughout her career, never added up to a comprehensive formal statement about what he meant to her or what their connection represented. They added up to something more honest, genuine, specific personal recollection maintained consistently across decades of changing circumstances, of a moment that had mattered to a 6-year-old child and continued mattering to the adult that child became. You do not actually meet Elvis, you just have to look at Elvis. In this single observation, Whitney captured something about the specific quality of extraordinary presence that she herself possessed, something she could identify from the outside at 6 years old, because she had experienced it in the only way such things can be genuinely understood, by standing in the room. The song connects them permanently in a way that goes beyond either of their individual relationships to it. Elvis wanted it and was prevented from having it. Whitney received it and made it definitively, irreversibly her own. Dolly Parton joked about the money Whitney's version earned her in specifically geographic terms, enough to buy Graceland, placing the whole story inside the same symbolic space that had housed so much of Presley's life, his most formative years, his final years, and his eventual burial. The joke lands because the connection it points to is real. These two voices, formed by the same gospel roots, are bound together permanently by a song that passed from one to the other across 2 decades, finding in each the love and the loss its lyrics describe. Whitney Houston saw Elvis Presley once, as a child, in a backstage room in Las Vegas. She never forgot it. Neither did the music that connected them, roots first laid down in churches in Mississippi and New Jersey, eventually finding each other in the most unexpected places. If this story gave you a fuller picture of 2 extraordinary lives that ran closer together than anyone realized, subscribe for more honest accounts of the connections history leaves hiding.